Congresswoman, let's be honest, aren't you just pulling the race card to dodge the real question? The sharp tone of Chris Wallace's question echoed through the studio like a thunderclap. The veteran journalist leaned forward in his chair, eyes locked on Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, who sat opposite him under the bright studio lights of Wallace One-on-One, his signature Sunday morning interview show. The audience gasped in disbelief. Camera operators exchanged stunned glances, and even the usually composed production assistant winced for half an hour. Wallace had pressed Crockett about her controversial bill on corporate tax reform, his patience thinning as she calmly countered each of his arguments with precise facts and well-documented examples. As the segment neared its end, Wallace dropped his usual composed style and went for what many viewers would later describe as a desperate gotcha. Question 1 meant to provoke emotion and overshadow Crockett's data-driven responses. Moments like these usually derail interviews. Accusing a guest of playing the race card often leads to either defensive anger or nervous retreat, both guaranteed to create viral clips that dominate political news cycles. The studio fell completely silent. Every eye turned toward Crockett. The production team held its breath, anticipating either a fiery exchange or an awkward pause. Instead, Crockett remained calm. She took a measured sip of water, gently set the glass down, and fixed her gaze on Wallace. When she finally spoke, her tone was steady and composed. "Chris," she began, deliberately using his first name, "I've cited 17 economic studies today. I've referenced the Congressional Budget Office's official report on my bill. I even quoted your own past remarks on similar legislation. Not once have I mentioned race." "You just did? And I think your audience deserves to know why." What she said next didn't just silence Chris Wallace, it marked the first time in his 5-decade career that he was truly at a loss for words. The exchange would soon be hailed by media experts as a masterclass in handling loaded questions, a moment destined to be studied in journalism and communications programs for years to come. Before we reveal the full response that left the studio speechless, make sure to hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We bring you the most unfiltered political moments reel. Exchanges that major networks often cut from their clips showing who's truly standing up for everyday Americans. That crisp Sunday morning in Manhattan, tension filled the sleek studio of Wallace One-on-One. Production assistants hurriedly adjusted lights and sound levels, while the show's executive producer paced anxiously, glancing at his watch. This wasn't just another political interview. It was a highly anticipated broadcast, weeks in the making. At 76, Chris Wallace stood as part of journalism's old guard. The son of 60 Minutes legend Mike Wallace, he had earned his own reputation as a tough, disciplined interviewer over a 50-year career spanning all 3 major networks and several cable channels. Having interviewed 8 U.S. presidents, dozens of world leaders, and countless politicians, Wallace was respected for his no-nonsense style and relentless pursuit of clear answers. Unlike many modern hosts, he was known less for partisanship and more for holding guests accountable through careful follow-up questions and logical consistency. His trademark approach, calmly leading interviewees into contradictions using their own statements, had made Wallace One-on-One essential viewing for politically engaged Americans. The Sunday morning slot gave his show power to set the tone for the national political conversation each week. Across from him sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, representing Texas's 30th district and rapidly rising as a national political force. At just 42, she symbolized a new generation of leadership, well-educated, policy-focused, and deeply connected to both young voters and traditional audiences. Before her political career, Crockett built a reputation as an expert economist specializing in tax systems and corporate finance. With a Ph.D. in economics from Northwestern and a law degree from Stanford, she had served in the U.S. Treasury Department under 2 administrations before returning to Texas to teach economic policy at the University of Texas. Her entrance into politics wasn't typical. Crockett first drew national attention for her viral testimony before the Senate Finance Committee, where she explained complicated tax loopholes in plain language the public could actually understand. When her district's longtime representative retired, she ran a grassroots campaign focused on middle-class economic issues and won both the primary and general elections decisively. In Congress, Crockett quickly developed a reputation for mastering legislative details rather than chasing headlines. Her dual expertise in law and economics made her uniquely capable of dissecting complex financial issues and presenting them in ways everyday people could relate to. Today's interview focused on her new corporate tax Transparency and Fairness Act, a bill aimed at reforming how multinational corporations report profits and pay taxes on overseas earnings. The proposal had drawn bipartisan attention, with several moderate Republicans signing on despite intense opposition from corporate lobbyists. The legislation targeted the practice of profit shifting to tax havens and sought to ensure fairness through transparency and stricter reporting rules rather than simply raising tax rates. The Congressional Budget Office estimated the bill could generate roughly $380 billion in revenue over 10 years without increasing tax rates just by closing loopholes and enforcing existing laws. Corporate trade groups launched major ad campaigns warning of job losses and reduced competitiveness, while pro-reform advocates praised it as a long overdue step toward accountability. The battle lines were clear: corporate giants on one side and reform-minded policymakers like Jasmine Crockett on the other. Chris Wallace's decision to invite Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett onto his show had sparked conversation across media circles. Known for challenging guests from every political background, Wallace had long held economic views that leaned toward the traditional pro-business side. Many journalists assumed this interview would be no exception, expecting him to echo corporate objections to Crockett's proposed legislation and create a tough setting for her to defend her bill. The network had heavily promoted the episode with bold teasers promising hard questions about a proposal that, in their words, could reshape corporate America. The studio audience that day consisted of politically active New Yorkers representing a wide range of views on economic policy. Producers intentionally selected participants who reflected the nation's diverse opinions about business, fairness, and taxation. What do you think about how the media handles complicated economic topics like corporate taxes? Have you noticed how many interviews focus on political drama instead of the actual details of proposed laws? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Our team wants to know how viewers like you feel about the quality of today's economic reporting and media coverage. As the red light above Camera 1 blinked on, Chris Wallace's familiar voice filled the studio. Welcome to Wallace One-on-One, where we hold in-depth conversations with the people shaping America's future. I'm Chris Wallace. The camera slowly panned across the minimalist set, two sleek chairs facing each other, framed by a wide window revealing the New York skyline in the background. My guest today is Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, whose corporate tax transparency and fairness Act has sparked major debate about how America taxes multinational corporations. Congresswoman, welcome to the show. Thank you for having me, Chris, Crockett replied with a warm, relaxed smile. Her outfit, a sharp navy blue suit paired with simple pearl earrings, was elegant yet understated, a deliberate contrast to the high-end fashion often worn by corporate executives featured on recent episodes. Wallace opened with his usual first question. For viewers who aren't economists, what exactly does your bill do? It closes 3 loopholes that let large corporations report different profit numbers depending on the audience. Crockett explained clearly. Right now, a company can tell shareholders it made billions in profits while telling the IRS it made next to nothing. My bill simply requires honest, consistent reporting and stops fake profit shifting to offshore tax havens where no real business happens. Wallace nodded slightly before launching his first challenge. Your critics say this bill would make U.S. companies less competitive internationally. The Chamber of Commerce estimates it could cost as many as 300,000 jobs. How do you respond to that? It was a predictable start classic corporate talking points, and Crockett was ready. Those numbers come from a flawed study that assumes my bill raises tax rates. It doesn't, she answered firmly. It just ensures companies pay what they already legally owe. And about competitiveness, let's look at the facts. She reached for a folder resting on the small table beside her. Here's a list of America's 50 largest companies. The 30 highlighted in yellow paid a lower effective tax rate than their global competitors over the past 5 years. The current system doesn't make them more competitive, it just helps them dodge taxes that smaller U.S. companies have to pay. Wallace blinked in, surprise at the detailed documentation before regaining his composure. But requiring American companies to pay more taxes than they do now, doesn't that hurt them on the world stage? Actually, studies from both the International Monetary Fund and the Congressional Research Service show no link between lower corporate tax rates and stronger competitiveness. Crockett countered smoothly. What truly drives competitiveness is modern infrastructure, quality education, and regulatory stability, all funded by tax revenue. For the next 15 minutes, the exchange followed this steady rhythm. Wallace presented standard critiques of corporate tax reform, and Crockett countered each point with specific data, academic research, and concrete examples. Rather than relying on vague statements, she named actual companies, cited tax provisions, and referenced detailed studies. When Wallace argued that her bill might hurt retirement accounts invested in corporate stocks, Crockett pointed out that the Congressional Budget Office had already analyzed potential market impacts and found them minimal. When he warned that it could reduce corporate investment, she referenced 2017 data showing that tax cuts had mostly funded stock buybacks, not job creation or capital expansion. As the discussion reached the halfway point, Wallace's tone began to shift. His trademark technique exposing inconsistencies in a guest's statements wasn't working. Crockett's responses were tight, internally consistent, and reinforced by verifiable evidence. Congresswoman, Wallace said. Changing strategy. You've criticized corporations for not paying their fair share. But that phrase, fair share, is subjective. What does it really mean to you? It was a classic pivot. Moving from data to philosophy when facts weren't landing. That's a great question, Chris, Crockett replied evenly. I define fair share as the amount a company is already required to pay under existing law. My bill doesn't add new taxes, it closes gaps that let corporations avoid paying what's already due. When a small business owner in Dallas ends up with a higher effective tax rate than a multinational firm reporting billions in profits, that's not only unfair, it's economically inefficient. It distorts competition and discourages innovation. Wallace pressed again. Your bill targets what you call artificial profit shifting, but companies argue they're simply following the law. Isn't this really about changing the rules because you don't like the results? Crockett didn't miss a beat. The law already bans profit shifting that lacks real economic activity. The issue is enforcement. If a company claims $10 billion in profit from an office in Bermuda staffed by 3 people, that clearly lacks economic substance. My bill just requires transparency, making those kinds of arrangements visible and accountable. By the 20-minute mark, Wallace's body language revealed growing frustration. His questions came faster, shorter, sharper. Crockett, however, stayed composed, factual, patient, and unflustered. The audience, which had started the show divided, was now leaning noticeably toward her side, nodding as she backed every answer with evidence instead of rhetoric. At that point, Chris Wallace decided to change tactics. You've described this bill as a way to help working Americans, he began. But isn't it really just pushing a progressive agenda that's unfriendly to business? The bill has 6 Republican co-sponsors, Chris, Crockett replied smoothly. Senator Hawley has even introduced a companion version in the Senate. This isn't about ideology, it's about fairness and economic efficiency. Even Adam Smith, the father of capitalism, said taxes should be certain, convenient, and proportional to one's ability to pay. The current system fails on all 3 counts. Wallace glanced down at his notes, hesitating for a moment. Then he made a move that would define the rest of the interview. Abandoning the policy debate, he shifted into more personal territory. Congresswoman, you've often emphasized your background as an economist, he said carefully. But some critics claim you rely more on your identity than your expertise to shield your ideas from scrutiny. How do you respond to that? The question landed with an uncomfortable weight. It was clearly intended to trigger an emotional or defensive reaction. The audience murmured uneasily at the sudden change in tone. Crockett paused briefly, then looked at Wallace calmly. "I'm not sure I understand the question, Chris," she said. "Which critics specifically have said that, and what parts of my identity are you referring to?" It was a brilliant reply. She didn't take the bait, didn't sound defensive, and forced Wallace to clarify his own premise. Realizing he'd been too vague, Wallace tried to reframe. "There's a perception," he continued, "that when you and others in your party are challenged on the details of your proposals, you sometimes imply the criticism is based on bias rather than genuine disagreement." "That's interesting," Crockett responded evenly. "In this conversation, I've cited the Congressional Budget Office, the International Monetary Fund, the Congressional Research Service, and even data from SEC filings. I haven't mentioned anything about personal identity. I'm happy to keep discussing the details of the bill. That's what I came here to do." Her response laid bare the disconnect between Wallace's question and the actual content of their discussion, leaving him momentarily off balance. As the interview moved into its final segment, Wallace went for one last shot. "Congresswoman," he said pointedly, "let's be honest, aren't you just playing the race card to avoid answering the real questions?" The words hung in the air. The studio fell completely silent. Every eye fixed on Crockett, waiting for her reaction to the provocative charge. Congresswoman Crockett took a slow, measured sip of water, then set her glass down carefully. Her expression remained composed and focused. When she finally spoke, her tone was calm but unmistakably firm. "Chris," she began, addressing him by his first name, "I've cited 17 economic studies during this interview. I've referred to the Congressional Budget Office's official report on my bill. I've even quoted your previous statements about similar legislation. Not once have I mentioned race, you just did. And I think your viewers deserve to understand why." The studio remained dead silent as she continued. "When we discuss tax policy, we should judge it on facts, its merits, its economic impact, its administrative feasibility. That's exactly what I've done today. I've brought data, research, and verifiable examples." Her gaze stayed fixed on Wallace, steady and respectful. "But when the facts are strong, some people try to change the subject. They suggest that someone like me couldn't possibly understand economics, despite my PhD and years at the Treasury Department. They imply that my arguments come from identity politics instead of sound reasoning." She gestured toward the documents neatly stacked beside her. "The numbers don't lie. Chris, the CBO report doesn't have a race or gender. The economic studies I've cited come from institutions across the political spectrum. Either my arguments hold up on their merits, or they don't." Then came the moment that would go viral across every major platform within hours. "I didn't bring my identity to this interview. Chris, I brought facts. And if someone finds it easier to debate who I am instead of what I'm saying, I trust your viewers are smart enough to see what's really happening." The audience erupted in spontaneous applause, a rare occurrence on Wallace One-on-One, which was usually known for its restrained tone. The seasoned journalist, famous for his unflappable composure, appeared visibly unsettled. As the clapping slowly subsided, Wallace tried to regain control. "Congresswoman, I wasn't suggesting, I know you weren't." "Chris," Crockett interjected gracefully, "you're one of the most respected journalists in the country because you focus on substance. That's why your question caught me off guard. It seemed out of character for someone known for serious, fact-based discussion." Her response managed to both challenge the question and offer Wallace a dignified way out, suggesting that his comment was an anomaly rather than his usual professional standard. Wallace paused, nodded slightly, and said quietly, "Fair point, Congresswoman. Let's get back to the bill." "I'd appreciate that," Crockett replied with a faint, polite smile. Wallace glanced again at his notes, then looked up. Your bill requires corporations to reconcile their financial statements for shareholders with what they report to the IRS. Critics say that creates unnecessary red tape that could hurt American businesses. How do you respond? Crockett didn't hesitate. Actually, most companies already perform these reconciliations internally, she explained, transitioning seamlessly back to substance. My bill only asks them to submit existing documentation. It doesn't require creating anything new. According to Treasury estimates, the additional cost of compliance is less than 0.01% of the affected company's revenues. She continued confidently. In fact, several CFOs I've spoken with privately have said they support this provision because it levels the playing field. Right now, companies that follow both the letter and the spirit of the law are at a disadvantage, compared to those that use loopholes to dodge taxes. This bill simply makes sure everyone plays by the same rules. For the remaining minutes of the interview, Wallace returned to his usual style, focused, analytical, and policy-driven. Congresswoman Crockett maintained her composure, answering each question with precise data and well-supported facts. The earlier tension that had filled the studio had dissolved, replaced by a calm, thoughtful exchange that drew the audience back into the heart of the policy debate. As the segment neared its end, Wallace leaned forward and asked a final question, his tone noticeably different. If your bill passes, he said, what measurable results should Americans expect to see to know it's truly working? It was a fair and genuine question, one that treated Crockett's proposal as a serious piece of legislation rather than a political talking point. 3 measurable outcomes, Crockett replied confidently. First, the gap between the effective tax rates of large corporations and small or medium-sized businesses should narrow substantially. Second, multinational companies should show at least a 40% drop in profit shifting to tax havens, as proven by country-by-country financial reporting. And third, annual corporate tax revenue should rise by around $38 billion, all without increasing the statutory rate. She paused briefly before adding, most importantly, these improvements will happen without any harm to legitimate business activity, investment or job creation as reflected in major economic indicators. As Wallace turned toward the camera for his closing remarks, he did something rarely seen on his show. Before we wrap up, he said, I want to acknowledge something. Congresswoman Crockett came prepared with facts, research, and real data. Whether you agree with her bill or not, this has been a genuine policy discussion, something our viewers deserve to see. He looked back at her and added, thank you for bringing such clarity and detail to this conversation. It was an unexpected moment of respect from a journalist known for maintaining strict neutrality. Crockett smiled and replied warmly, thank you. Chris, that's what Americans want? Real conversations about how policy affects their daily lives. Not political theater. As the off-air sign lit up, the studio erupted in a standing ovation, not just for Crockett, but for the rare sight of a political interview centered on substance rather than spectacle. Crew members exchanged astonished glances. One staffer whispered, did Wallace just admit he was wrong? I've worked here 5 years and never seen that. Later, in the green room, Wallace approached Crockett privately. His tone was sincere. Congresswoman, I've interviewed hundreds of politicians. Very few come as prepared as you did today, and even fewer stay composed when challenged. That was truly impressive. Crockett smiled appreciatively. I respect that, Chris, and I respect your work. That's why I was surprised by that one question. It didn't sound like you. Wallace nodded, almost reflective. You're right. When things don't go as planned, sometimes even seasoned interviewers fall into bad habits. Today reminded me that even after 50 years in this business, I can still learn something. By the time Crockett's flight landed back in Washington that evening, the interview had become a nationwide sensation. Video clips of her calm, fact-based exchange were spreading rapidly across social media platforms, amassing millions of views. Viewers from across the political spectrum praised her command of complex issues and her steady demeanor. Even conservative commentators joined in. This is how real policy debate should look, wrote one well-known conservative economist on X, formerly Twitter. Clear data, solid arguments, and no slogans. Whether you agree or disagree, she showed how serious discussions should be handled. Major news outlets spent the next day dissecting the interview. On Morning Joe, Joe Scarborough commented, "That wasn't just a politician handling a tough moment. It was a masterclass in how to bring real substance back into politics." Even on Fox News, a panelist on The Five admitted, "Whatever your stance." Crockett showed up with receipts, facts, figures, and verifiable sources. That's something every voter should demand. The ripple effects went far beyond media praise. Within days, 3 more Republican representatives joined as co-sponsors of Crockett's bill, raising the total to 9, a remarkable show of bipartisan support for tax reform. Senator Hawley, who had introduced the Senate version, publicly applauded her performance. "That's how you defend smart policy, with facts, not sound bites," he said. She proved corporate tax fairness isn't a partisan issue, it's an American one. Even the business lobby began to shift. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which had previously opposed the legislation, announced it was reassessing key provisions, acknowledging that some parts may have real merit. A senior industry lobbyist told Politico privately, "After that interview, we can't keep using empty talking points." She exposed exactly where the loopholes are. Either we engage with the facts or we lose the debate. For Wallace, the moment became a turning point. On a later journalism podcast, he reflected openly. "I've built my career on tough, substantive interviews," he said. "But in that moment, I fell into the trap so many of us do, chasing conflict instead of clarity. When her answers stayed grounded in substance, I should have done the same." The Crockett-Wallace interview would be remembered not for the confrontation, but for how it ended, 2 professionals reminding a divided nation that facts, respect, and reason still have a place in American public life. Wallace leaned back slightly and added, "What truly impressed me was how Congresswoman Crockett addressed my question directly without making it personal or partisan. She turned a potentially hostile moment into an opportunity for real dialogue. That's a lesson every journalist can learn from." Media analysts soon echoed that sentiment. The discussion quickly moved beyond the interview itself to a wider reflection on how American journalism covers economic policy. The Columbia Journalism Review released a detailed feature titled, "The Crockett Standard: Bringing Substance Back to Economic Coverage." The article examined how rare it had become for complex policy conversations to make it onto national television, without being reduced to shallow political drama. What stood out, the piece noted, wasn't just Crockett's grace under pressure, but the 20 minutes of genuine policy discussion that came before the viral exchange where a member of Congress showcased deep expertise, while a veteran journalist pressed her on details instead of political positioning. For Congresswoman Crockett, the effects of that morning interview went far beyond a single news cycle. What began as a typical Sunday show appearance evolved into a defining chapter in her career, one that solidified her reputation as a serious economic thinker and an effective communicator of complex ideas. When her corporate tax transparency bill reached the House floor 3 weeks later, the tone of the debate reflected this shift. Instead of the usual partisan rhetoric, lawmakers from both sides engaged with the substance, analyzing the bill's real economic implications. The final vote surprised many. It passed with the support of 47 Republicans, a rare bipartisan victory for tax reform. In the Senate, where the companion bill had been stuck in committee, the renewed attention helped push it forward. It eventually passed with 62 votes, including 12 Republicans crossing party lines. When President Biden signed the Corporate Tax Transparency and Fairness Act into law during a White House ceremony, both Crockett and Senator Hawley stood beside him, a striking visual of how evidence-based policymaking could transcend party boundaries. This law shows that when we focus on facts and fairness, we can still solve real problems together, President Biden said during the signing. Congresswoman Crockett proved that complicated economic policy can be communicated clearly, defended with substance, and passed with bipartisan support. The law's implementation set a new benchmark for corporate transparency. For the first time,